So our reading this morning gives us an image, which gives us a word picture of what Jesus is like, why we should worship him, why we should cling to our faith in Jesus. And the picture that we're going to explore this morning is that of the high priest. But I think it's my first job this morning to explain to you why the image of high priest is meaningful to us at all. Most of us have very little knowledge of what it means to be a high priest. And that's a difficult thing for us then to relate to our everyday lives. Our passage includes both the image of the high priest and then an argument which argues that Jesus is a high priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. Something that probably makes some of our eyes just glaze over because we don't understand what these words mean or how they can relate to us today. Even though these images are hard to relate to our modern lives, the arguments contained in the book of Hebrews actually was very sophisticated Greek rhetoric in its time. The author of Hebrews was very educated and very good at persuading his audience to his point of view. So this was actually a very meaningful image and a very convincing argument to the original readers and hearers of the letter. And so let's see if we can get back for us some of those things that we might find confusing and find a way that this image applies to our everyday lives today. So we have to start with defining high priest. What precisely do we mean when we're talking about a high priest? Some may be familiar with the word priest from a modern church setting, but the modern day priest is not the same as a high priest or even a priest from the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, there were 3 offices that guided all the people of Israel. The prophet, you guys probably know a little bit more about what a prophet is. A priest, and then a king. Those 3 people were supposed to govern the land of Israel, and it's just an aside, a freebie this morning, that Jesus is compared to all 3 of those at different points in the New Testament. But that's not really what we're talking about this morning. So what does a high priest do? Well, a priest was anyone who represented people to God and then God to people. A priest is kind of a middleman, if you will, who approached God on behalf of the people. For instance, after God led the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt, they came to the foot of Mount Sinai. And there God told Moses that he was going to speak to the people of Israel, and he said that all the people needed to prepare themselves. And then we read, on the morning of the 3rd day, there was thunder and lightning, there was a thick cloud covering the mountain, and a very loud trumpet blast, and everyone in the camp trembled. And then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. And Mount Sinai was covered in smoke, because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like a smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. And as the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and the voice of the Lord answered him. The people, understandably, were a little intimidated by this smoking, trembling mountain. And so a little later we read, when the people saw the thunder and lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain in smoke, they trembled with fear, and they stayed at a distance, and they said, "Speak to us yourself, and we will listen. But do not have God speak to us, or we will die." And thus is born the role of a high priest, or a priest at all. The priest goes to God on behalf of the people, and then represents back to the people what they hear God saying. In the Old Testament, a priest was the one that you brought the sacrifice to, and then he would slaughter the animal, and then he would offer prayers to God on behalf of that person, and then he would bless the people in response. In addition to those kind of duties, the high priest had a very special duty. One time a year, he would go into the holiest part of the temple, the most inner part of the temple. It's called the Day of Atonement. And then he would offer a sacrifice in the holiest part of the temple, both for his own sins and the sins of the people that they committed in ignorance or unwittingly throughout that year. No one else was allowed to approach the Holy of Holies. In fact, when the high priest went in there, he had bells sewn into the bottom of his garment so that he would make a jingling noise as he walked. And if the bells stopped going and they thought that perhaps the priest had become ill or died and couldn't come out under his own power, there was a rope tied to his ankle so they could haul him out. Because if anyone else went in there, even in the dire situation to rescue or help the high priest, they would probably die. That was what they thought. So it was a very special place, a very holy place. And so all the priests, but especially the high priest, had the job of going to God on behalf of the people. And so this is the word picture we get from Hebrews. That particular role is the one that Jesus plays for us who are his people. No one has ever seen God. We're not able to get to God on our own, but Jesus goes before us, and he represents his people to God. According to the letter to the Hebrews, though, the very characteristic, there's one special characteristic that makes Jesus the perfect high priest for us, the kind of high priest that we need, and it's this: Jesus is sympathetic to us. Jesus, the high priest, has sympathy for his people because Jesus, the high priest, was one of them. Now, this is a story that's often told around Christmas time, especially at Christmas Eve, so some of you may have heard it before. But it goes like this. In a column entitled "The Man and the Birds," religion editor Louis Cassels recounts the story of a man who refused to attend a Christmas Eve service with his family because he did not believe that Jesus came to earth to become a man. He remained at home where it began to snow, and minutes later, he heard what he thought was someone throwing snowballs against his window. And going outside to investigate what was going on, he found a flock of birds were trying to fly into his house. They were hitting the window. That was the sound that he heard. And so he had a nice barn out back, and he thought that maybe these birds could take shelter from the storm in his barn. And so he made his way there, and he opened the doors and he turned on the light, but it didn't work. The birds wouldn't come into the barn. And so he created a trail of breadcrumbs for the birds to follow so that they could go into the barn, but they wouldn't do that either. And so he tried to get behind them and shoo them into the barn, but that didn't work either. And he sat down and he thought, well, if only I could be a bird myself for a few minutes. Maybe I could tell them, maybe I could lead them to safety. And at that moment, the church bells began to ring, and the man sank to his knees, and he said, "Now I understand." He suddenly realized why Jesus had to become a person. Jesus became like us so that he could lead us to safety. He could show us the way to the Father. Earlier in the letter to the Hebrews, we're told that Jesus is like our brother. And as a brother, he's not ashamed to call us his brothers or his sisters. And again, it's this idea that Jesus is related to us, that he became like us in every way that makes Jesus the perfect high priest. In 4:15 we read, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, and yet without sin." One pastor that I listened to on the internet told a story of how one day he was greeting people at the back of the sanctuary on their way out, and a woman came to him and she said, "Pastor, you said that we are forgiven. If you really knew me, you would never say that I was forgiven." I wonder if you've ever felt that way. If you've ever wondered if the people at church, if they really knew you, that they would never say anything to you about grace and being forgiven. Or maybe you felt that if God really knew you, he wouldn't even bother forgiving you. This is precisely the point that the author is trying to make. Jesus does know us. First of all, he knows us because he was with us He knows what it's like to be a person. He knows what it's like to suffer and face the kind of temptations that each and every one of us faces on an everyday basis. Jesus pleads our salvation before God because he sympathizes and empathizes with human suffering. Jesus knew anguish and he knew suffering. For instance, at the tomb of Lazarus, Jesus wept, we read. On the cross, we know that Jesus bled and suffered and cried out in agony, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Thus, the one who prays for us knows a great deal about what it means to suffer. He's acquainted with groaning and with grief. He's familiar with what it's like to have a body, and a body that was wounded. His body was wounded by foolish people. Our bodies sometimes are as well. Sometimes they're wounded by sickness or disease, and sometimes there are other things that come into our lives. But this is what makes Jesus able to go to God on our behalf. He's been there. He understands the pressures that we face, the way that life pulls and wounds each of us. Now, I want to say something about that word that's really difficult for us, the name that means nothing to us, Melchizedek. If you're confused when you read about this, you're probably not alone. Melchizedek shows up in the Old Testament. He shows up in Genesis 14, verses 17 to 20. And he shows up once again in Psalm 110, which is the psalm that's actually being quoted here in Hebrews. So that's twice. He shows up twice in the Old Testament. And aside from the references, and there are quite a few to him in the book of Hebrews, he doesn't show up again in the entire scriptures. He's kind of an obscure figure. This is an example of a Bible writer in the New Testament trying to interpret the Old Testament or the First Testament for us. One reason he does this is that priests, he's calling Jesus a high priest, and priests were supposed to come from the tribe of Levi. Jesus did not come from the tribe of Levi, he came from the tribe of Judah. And so many people have pointed out that the author here is trying to justify why he can call Jesus a priest, even though he does not come from the Jewish tribe of Levi. And this is probably true. The author's trying to point this out here. But he turns to this figure for another reason, I think. This figure is a very fascinating figure. And the reason he uses Melchizedek at all is that tells us a lot about who Jesus is. I'm indebted to one of the commentators I was reading this week for this particular interpretation. But the story of Melchizedek, which is tied up with the story of Abraham, the father of Israel, goes like this. Abram had been told by God to pick up from his land, the only home that he had ever known, and go to a new place. Now, you can't possibly imagine how big this is unless you have been among people who are rooted to their land through many generations. God was asking something very big of Abram here. In return, God said he would bless him. He would make him the father of many nations. And after he settled down, he was still childless. So much for the father of nations. He was in some significant struggles at this time with his nephew Lot. And then he found himself in the middle of a great big war, a war among many kings. Now, if Abram's story had stopped here, if he just left his land, remained childless, and been involved in this great war, he would have been a laughing stock. A sad laughing stock whose life had been completely turned upside down by the God who asked him to move, who promised that he would in return make him the king of great nations. And all he had to show for this was strife and war and barrenness. Now, Abram, as it turns out, won the war. And as the kings were settling the tab, in comes a new figure with a name that had never been referenced before. And in the narrative of the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, wouldn't be referenced again. A figure that appears and then vanishes again with hardly a comment. His name is Melchizedek. The name literally means King of Righteousness. He's identified as the king of Salem, and Salem means peace. He's also identified as the priest of the God Most High. And so he comes into the valley with the other kings, and he offers bread and wine, and he blesses Abram. So this guy is the king of righteousness and the king of peace and the high priest of the God of gods, and he comes to Abram and he offers him a meal of bread and wine and a blessing. Does any of that sound familiar to you? When Abram was perhaps at his lowest, his life is spinning out of control, in comes a priest king with a meal and peace and blessing. And he comes unbidden and unasked for. He just comes. It's no wonder that centuries and centuries later, in the wake of the death and resurrection of Jesus, that the first Christians identified this particular priest king as Jesus. Jesus, they said, wasn't new. He wasn't born yesterday. He was there ministering to the people of the Old Testament, bringing the same blessing, bringing the same meal, bringing the same righteousness and the same peace. Jesus is cut from the same cloth as this Melchizedek. Jesus is a high priest in the order of Melchizedek. Just when Abram's life was spinning out of control, in comes this priest king in order to help him and to feed him and to bless him and to encourage him. And this is what Jesus does for us as well. We're told that like this Melchizedek, Jesus is there right when we need him. He just comes. He just comes with peace and righteousness and blessing and a sacred meal. Jesus is the one who comes to us when our lives are spinning out of control, when we're at our very lowest. And he helps us, and he feeds us with his flesh, and he blesses and encourages us. And this is the kind of high priest that I think that I need, I think that many of us need. It's a comfortable image. It's comfortable to know that Jesus is there when we need him the most. He'll come riding into the valley, bringing us exactly what we need, even if we forget to ask him to come, even if we didn't realize that we needed him there in the first place. Therefore, since we have such a great high priest who has gone through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess, since Hebrews 4:14. This letter was written to encourage people to hold on to their faith in Jesus, a Jesus who became like us, who walked with us, who moved into the neighborhood, as Eugene Peterson puts it. During the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with loud cries and tears to the one who could save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverent submission. Although he was a son, he learned obedience from what he suffered, and once he was made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who would obey him. Now, some people might think that Jesus, the Son of God, should not have to suffer. He should be privileged. On the contrary, even though he was God's son, he still needed to experience what it means to be human and to face adversity. So now Jesus is there with God, bringing a real understanding of what it means to be human right into the heart of God. We might have other ways of saying it, but the message is clear enough. Right at the heart of God, there is an empathetic love for those of us who are still on life's journey. So Jesus is there with God, bringing a real understanding of what it means to be human right into the heart of God. And that's why we need to hold on to the faith that we profess. The reason this letter was written to the suffering Jewish Christians to not give up their faith in Jesus is this: because they can trust in the heart of God. When we say that we trust in the heart of God, it does not mean that we simply believe that God exists. It doesn't mean that we just nod our heads in agreement at the doctrine that we're shown. Rather, as one author puts it, faith is understood in terms of a continually tested belief in God's goodness and mercy. Doubt, then, is a mirror image of faith. Doubt is not disbelief in the existence of God, but the suspicion that mercy is not found in God's innermost heart. We have been reminded this morning that God's innermost heart is full of grace and full of mercy and full of sympathy because our high priest is there. And he's become like us in every way, learning obedience through suffering, so that he might be able to take our cares and our worries and our sorrows and our griefs and our problems and our fears straight into the heart of a very loving God. So what does that mean for us? Well, in our passage for study, and in fact much of Hebrews, the writer focuses on failing faith. Our constant failure to honor the Lord, along with the push and shove of life from without and doubts and fears from within, all of these can undermine our faith. Our weaknesses are legion. Such weaknesses tell us that it's hard to be sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. Yet we have a great high priest who is enthroned in the heavenlies, whom we can freely approach for overflowing mercy and kindly support. In his earthly journey, he experienced every possible attack upon his person, such that he could only fully empathize with us and support us, and he can secure us in our faithfulness. So let us then, in the face of our frail humanity, look to the one who will firmly hold us in the thread of faith. He never lets us go, and so we trust in him. The temptation for us who know ourselves so well, who live with our personal failings and our bad moods and our hidden sins and the cracks in our own lives, it's easy for us to distrust the merciful heart of God, thinking if God really knew me, then he would never say that I was forgiven. And so we want to cover up and we want to hide and we want to not share with God those things that worry us or upset us or we think make us look bad before him. We want to hide our worst selves from God. And yet, we learned that God is fully aware of us. He knows who we are. He knows our fears and our failings because he lived it too. He walked among us. He moved into the neighborhood. He threw his lot in with ours. He experienced our weakness and our sufferings. And because we have such a great high priest, this has one very important implication for us. As it says in verse 4:16 of our reading, let us approach the throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Let us approach the throne of grace with confidence. Other translations offer boldly or fearlessly. We have confidence, we have boldness, we have fearlessness when we approach God in prayer, and this is because of the work of Jesus, our high priest. The Message renders Hebrews 4:16 this way: so let's walk right up to him and get what he's so ready to give. Take the mercy, accept the help. Since Christ is with us, we can go to God with confidence and courage, boldness, relying on the promise that God will hear our prayers. And the spirit of boldness also shows us how we can live the challenges of our lives. We approach them not in a foolhardy way, but with the determination of someone who knows the greatest physician and the ultimate deliverer. What a friend we have in Jesus, who is our high priest. Would you pray with me as we close this morning? Our loving God, we thank you so much for the gift of Jesus. We thank you that because he came to earth and lived with us, because he moved into the neighborhood, we can be assured that whenever we approach God in prayer, we can have confidence and boldness even because of God's great love and understanding and care for each of us. We ask for the grace to approach you often in prayer and to receive the mercy and help that you are so ready to give us. These things we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.